Okay, so from this point onwards, we are going to discuss about how the calculations, or like how to determine some of the characteristics regarding the regarding a network. That is the way that you are going to approach your requirement in the network diagram, right? Network diagram එක දීලා ඔයගලන්ට devices වලට IP addresses assign කරන්න කිව්වම මේ calculation එක either roughly or either in the paper should be done. එක ප්‍රශ්නේ කියලා තියෙනවා calculations පෙන්වන්න කියලා කිව්වොත් ඕගොල්ලෝ paper එකේ part එකක් විදිහට කරන්න ඕනේ. නැත්නම් just IP range එකක් වගේ අහලා තිබ්බොත් so you do it you can do the rough work and you can provide the answer, right? All right, so with these reasons, right, with these details, we can determine these kind of things, right? So I'm going to write the equation in a one particular place so you can see all things together, right? එතකොට ඉස්සරහටත් ඒක අපිට එක සැරේ view කරගන්න පුළුවන්. ඕගොල්ලොත් ඒක එක තැනක ලියාගත්තට කමක් නැහැ. මොකද මම ඒක question එකක් පාවිච්චි කරගෙන තමයි ඕගලන්ට කතා බහ කරගෙන යන්නේ. Right? So I'll illustrate the equation separately, then I'm giving the example, right? Okay, so let's start. So the first equation, yeah, all these things are there when you know the number of bits into the net ID and host ID when you determine those things, right? Determine කරගන්න පුළුවන් විදිහ මම ඔයගලන්ට මේකට පස්සේ කියන අගට දෙනවා. මොකද මේ calculations method ඔයගලන්ට figure out වෙනවා මේක determine කරගන්න පුළුවන් විදි මොනවද කියලා, right? Okay, so the first equation, number of networks, right? So this can be equals to 2 to the power number of net ID bits without leading bits. Right, so number of networks are equals to number of net ID bits without leading bits, right? So if you are given with an IP address and ask the question how many networks of this kind can be made, මේ වගේ networks කොච්චර හදන්න පුළුවන්ද කියලා කිව්වොත්, so you determine what is the number of bits in the net ID. Then you have to figure out how many leading bits should be there within it. Then you have to omit that leading bits, and the other rest of the bits of the net ID will give you the answer, right? So I'll write the example at the right side. So this is the example. මෙච්චර ලොකු විස්තරයක් ලියන්න එපා. ඒක අපි සරලව කරමු. right? Find the number of networks of this kind, right? So it's pretty easy with the find the number of networks of ප්‍රශ්නීට වැඩිය පැහැදිලි වෙන්න ඕනේ. වයිට් බෝඩ් එක පොඩ්ඩක් රෙස්පොන්ඩ් කරන්න වෙලා යනවා ළමයි පොඩ්ඩක් ඉන්න. Right. So it is easy. So we are going to say this should be equals to two to the power 24. Why I'm saying it's 2 to the power 24? Because CIDR notification says how many net ID bits are there. Yeah, 2 to the power 24 is not the one. I wrote it in an incorrect manner. So CIDR notification says it's 24. There are 24 net ID bits in there. And look at the equation. It says number of net ID bits without leading bits. So we need to figure out if the IP address start from the value 192, how many net ID bits are there like removing or deducting the leading bits. So if you refer to your graph or the table that you have drawn in the previous day, you can see 192 belongs to the class C, and class C has 3 leading bits, right? So what you are going to do is you deduct 3 leading bits from the 24. So it's going to be 24 minus 3, which gives you 2 to the power 21 as the answer. So this second equation, now I'm referring to that particular IP address. So here comes the second equation. Number of hosts. Hosts කියලා කියන්නේ devices high කරන්න පුළුවන් devices ගන්න. network එකට high කරන්න පුළුවන් devices ගන්න. Right? Number of hosts in a network. Number of hosts in a network. එක network එකක. ඒ කියන්නේ අපිට provide කරලා තියෙන IP එකට අදාළ network එකේ උපරිම maximum කොච්චර host ගානක් connect කරන්න පුළුවන්. Right? So this can be found out taking host bits as a 2 to the power. Then from that particular answer, we are going to reduce a 2. Right? So දීලා තියෙන IP address එකේ host ID bits ගාන 2 to the power එකක් විදියට අරගෙන ඒ උත්තරෙන් දෙකක් අඩු කරන්න ඕනේ. Right? So that's going to give you number of hosts that can be connected to that particular network, which is the maximum number. එතකොට maximum number එකම high කරන්නත් පුළුවන්, ඊට අඩුවෙන් high කරගන්නත් පුළුවන්, no problem. Right? අපිට maximum number එක 14යි කියලා හම්බුනොත් devices 14ක් maximum high කරන්න පුළුවන්. 14ට වඩා අඩුවෙන්, ඒ කියන්නේ එක device එකක් දක්වා වෙනකන් අඩු කර කර high කරගන්නත් පුළුවන්, no problem. Right, so this is going to be the second example on this manner, right? Right, find the number of hosts in this network. Hold on. Find the number of hosts that can be connected to this network. Right. So it's a very easy thing to do. Now we know the answer. So how it's going to be? It's going to be equals 2 to the power host bits minus 2. ළමයි මේක පොට්ටක් මේ equation එක චුට්ටක් හදාගන්න host id bits කියලා. ඒක අපි පුරුද්දට host bits කියලා කියනවා. ඒකයි මටත් ඒක එහෙම ලියවිලා තියෙන්නේ. It's better you make the equation like host id bits. Right. I'll do the changes in my equation as well. So this is going to be 2 to the power 8 minus 2. So that means 254. Right. So from the equation we know I'm changing this into host id bits. Right. So we know from the IP address that is given to us, which is 192, and the CIDR is ending as /24. So /24 indicates you there are 24 net ID bits. So net ID bits තියෙන්නේ 24යි නම් host bits should be 32 minus 24. නේද? එතකොට අපි දීලා තියෙන IP address එකට අදාළව net ID host ID picture එක ඇඳගත්තොත් class එකෙන් මොනද math එකේ දීලාම තියෙනවා 24 bits වලට තමයි settle වෙන්නේ කියලා net id එක. so 32කින් a24 අඩු කරාම අපිට 8ක් කියලා අඳුන ගන්න පුළුවන්. so the next one or the third equation is like this. Now remember, this actually is going to be a calculation, but it should be done by us. ඔගොල්ලෝ ලියුවෙන් පස්සේ මේක තේරෙයි කොහොමද මේ කියන්නේ equation එකක් නෙවෙයි මේක concept එකක්. But according to that concept we have to calculate. Right? Okay, so the third one is about the network address. Right, now how we are going to find the network address? There are two things that we need to do. Keep net id as it is, set, it's better I say net id bits, net id bits as it is, set host id bits into zeros. So what I have said, keep to generate the network address, keep net id bits as it is, set host id bits into zeros. Now when it comes to the bits, the word bits, it is talking about the bits of an octet, right? එතකොට අර අපේ සාමාන්‍ය IP address එකේ අපිට පේන dotted decimal ටික ගැන නෙවෙයි දැන් අපි මේ කතා වෙන්නේ dotted decimal ටික represent කරන bits ටික ගැන, ones and zeros ටික ගැන. එතකොට මේක කියලා තියෙන network address එක හොයාගන්න නම් keep net id bits as it is, කියන්නේ වෙනස් කරන්න එපා, set host id bits into zeros. So my third question, third part is asking, find the network address of this network. Right? So when they ask us to do this, first thing we have to recognize what represent the network, what represent the host. So to illustrate that, I am going to write the IP address again. So our IP address is 192.168.64.15/24. So that means now this 24 indicates up to this point, it is net id, and from this point onwards it is the host id. හරි, මම මේ ලියපු එක තේරුණාද? Right. Okay. So then what we are going to do is we are going to apply the theory. Theory says to find the network address, keep the net id bits as it is. So that means inside this 192, so 192 will be representing some binary pattern. So we are asked to keep it as it is. ඒ කියන්නේ 192 කියන සංඛ්‍යාව වෙනස් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. And again, 168 representing some binary pattern. And we are asked to keep it as it is because it is inside the net ID. And again, 64 will be represented in some binary pattern. And again, we are asked to keep it as it is because the concept of generating the network address is keeping the net ID bits as it is and changing the host ID bits into zeros, right? So now I'm going to change the host ID bits into zeros. Whatever the bits are there, whether it is zero, we don't need to convert them into zero, but whether there is ones, they are going to be converted into zero. That means all the host ID is going to represent a series of zeros. Zeros, පේලියක් තමයි ඔයාලට දකින්න හම්බෙන්නේ host ID එකේ. So I'm going to do it like this. So 192, 168 won't change. 64 won't change, and this host ID has 8 bits, so those 8 are changed into zeros like this. So which gives you the IP address 192.168.64.0, which is the network address. So the fourth one, I'm going to introduce you to the broadcast address. Now, network address means, network address means the address which defines the entire network. Then ඔයගලන්ගේ ඉස්කෝලේ lab එකේ තියෙනවා නම් network එකක්, ඒ lab එකට network address එකක් තියෙනවා. දැන් ඔයගලන්ට ඉස්කෝලේ lab එකේ computer එකක් on කරලා, if you can find the IP address of it, so you can determine what is the network address. Right? So ඔයාගේ network එක සම්පූර්ණයෙන් අඳුනගන්නේ network address එක. Right? If someone needs to send a message to entire network at once, සම්පූර්ණ network එකටම එක සැරේ address message එකක් එවන්න අවශ්‍ය නම්, they use the broadcast address that particular network. Right? Broadcast address. So how we are going to find the broadcast address? Something similar to find the network address. So the theory is keep the net ID bits as it is, set host ID bits into ones. Previously it was sent as zeros, now it is sent as ones. Right? So according to that, I'm going to ask the next question, and I'm asked to find the broadcast address of this network. So you are going to do a very simple thing. You are going to keep your net IDs as it is and change in your host ID bits into ones. So that means host ID bit will have series of ones. මෙතන තිබුණේ බිංදු 8ක්නේ. දැන් broadcast එක හැදෙනකොට host ID එකේව තියෙන එකේව 8ක් මේ question එකට අදාළව. Right? So then you can have the idea how it's going to be. So let me ask the question. Find the broadcast address of this network. So I'm going to do this 192.168.64.15/24. That's what I have given. Then මම මේක first time හදන නිසා නැවත නැවත මෙතන net id host id කියලා ලියනවා. So you don't need to do it when you are doing the calculations, right? So what it says, the concept says, keep the net id as it is. So 192 won't change, 168 won't change, 64 won't change. Why? What is the reason? Because net id penetrates all 3 octets, first 3 octets, right? Then my host id is going to be all ones. So which gives us 192.168.64.255. Fifth equation, or the fifth concept, is called the IP range, right? Then IP range එක හොයාගන්න හරි lazy. To find the IP range, we need this network address and the broadcast address. Network address and the broadcast address. So to find the IP address, to find the IP range, what we are doing is we are considering the next address after the network address and the one before to the broadcast address, right? So fifth one is about finding the IP range there are two concepts, which are IP range and usable IP range. What I was telling you is a usable IP range. First, I'll write the IP range. IP range is a simple concept. IP range means from network address to broadcast address. Right? It is simple. So according to this particular example, so IP range will be 192.168.64.0 to 192.168.64.255 because it is the broadcast address. And if you ask with a usable IP range, now usable IP range term comes to the play when we need to apply the IP addresses to the devices. Usable කියලා කියන්නේ devices වලට දෙන්න පුළුවන් range එක. දැන් මේ කතා කරේ ඔක්කොම IP range එක. මේ network එකේ ගන්න පුළුවන්. So the usable IP range this says from next address after network address to previous address before the broadcast address. Right? So next address after the network address means, according to this calculation, next address is going to be 192.168.64.1. right මොකද මෙයාගේ range එකේ ඉන්නේ 0 to 255 නේ 0 to 255 තමයි range එක network එකේදී 0 කියලා තියෙනවා broadcast එකේ 255 කියලා තියෙනවනේ ඉතිරි කෑල්ල සමාන මම ඒකයි මේ අන්තිම දෙන්න අරගත්තා එතකොට next address එක කියන්නේ network එකට පස්සේ එක the one before broadcast means 254 right so we can say the next address is 192.168.64.1 to 192.168.64.254 as the usable IP range. තේරුණාද මං කියපු එක? Right, so I am extending the question. So it is going to be the fifth question. Write the IP range and usable IP range of this network. So for your information, දීලක ඉන්න මම එක ලියුවයින් පස්සේ ඔයාලට figure out වෙයි. For your information, I'm writing network address which we have found already 192.168.64.0 broadcast address 192.168.64.255 right so I'm writing first the IP range one nine two dot 168.64.0 to 192.168.64.255 so which is the same addresses IP range එක කියලා කියන්නේ from network address to broadcast address so to usable IP range usable IP range is 192.168.64.1 මොකද 0 වලට පස්සේ තියෙන අගය 1 to 192.168.64.254 right so this is the next address of the network address this is the previous address of the broadcast address අපි මේකේ අහන අන්තිම ප්‍රශ්නේ තමයි subnet mask එක කියලා කියන්නේ find the subnet mask of this network. එතකොට subnet mask එක හොයන්නේ. ඒක අපේ 7 වෙනි සමීකරණය. එතකොට ඔක්කොම සමීකරණ 8ක් වෙනවා. 7 වෙනි සමීකරණය. 8 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 වෙනි සමීකරණ අටවෙනි එක අද කතා කරන්නේ එක subnet වලට අදාළ එකක්. Subnet mask. Now, the way we can find the subnet mask is set net ID bits into ones, set host ID bits into zeros. net ID bits ඔක්කොම එකේව කරනවා, host ID bits ඔක්කොම zeros කරනවා. එතකොට ඔයගලන්ට හම්බෙනවා අදාළ network එකකට තියෙන subnet mask එක. Right? So I'm illustrating this. 192.168.64.15/24 is the given IP address. So this is the net ID and this is the host ID. And what we were saying is setting net ID into all ones and setting host IDs into all zeros. So setting net ID into all ones means නේද මෙතන 8 දෙනාම එක ඒවා කරන්න ඕනේ. පළවෙනි ඔක්ටෙට් එකේ dot ඊළඟ ඔක්ටෙට් එකෙත් 8 දෙනාම එක ඒවා කරන්න ඕනේ. හේතුව තමයි net ID එකේ bits ඔක්කොම එක ඒවා කරන්න කියලා කියන්නේ. And host ID bits representing zeros. Which gives us the IP address 255.255.255.0.